Rana, when I was, asked to do this conversation with you, and I got this book, Tears of the Begums, I have to say it was really gut-wrenching and very hard to read some of these essays. Maybe first you tell us a little bit about Khwaja Hasan Nizami and the fact that this man wrote this book and so many versions as well of these stories. But also the fact, so there are two parts to my question. One, that, that he's written this seminal collection of essays of a very brutal time. Or दूसरी बात ये कि that there are so many languages in which it got translated, and I would think unusually not so in English. So tell us about both of these things, please.
Khwaja Hasan Nizami, and this book is dedicated to him, was a Sufi saint. He was the Gadinashin of Hazrat Nizamuddin Aulia. And at the time of 1857, when the first war of Indian independence happened, or as I like to call it, uprising, it's been called Ghadar, etc., etc. When it happened, his grandfather was the Sajada Nashin in the Dargah. And when Bahadur Shah Zafar flees from the Red Fort on 17th of September 1857, he comes first to the Dargah because he has some relics of the Prophet with him, and he wants to hand them over to the Sajada Nashin for safekeeping. It's there even today. Every 12th Rabi Awwal, that is Bara Wafat, the birthday of the Prophet, those relics are shown. There's a Mu'e Mubarak, that's the hair from the beard, etc., etc., that are shown there. So that's a connection that is, running through. And as Khwaja Hasan Nizami was growing up, he heard these tales from his mother and his grandfather, and that invoked in him a desire to find who were the surviving, the victims of 1857, because we know Bahadur Shah Zafar, Zinat Mahal, and two of his sons were exiled to Rangoon. But what happened to the rest? There were more than 3,000 people living inside the fort at that point of time, and they were all chased out of the fort. The fort was captured, and everyone, either the Mughals who were living inside that, or the house of Taimur, as they called themselves, either they were killed or they were captured or imprisoned, or something other very disastrous happened to them. A few of them managed to escape, and these are their stories. So Khwaja Hasan Nizami went to, he went to all the places, wherever he would hear, he found so many of the survivors living in Hazrat Nizamuddin Basti, where he talks to the daughter of Bahadur Shah Zafar, and he talks to the grandchildren. Then he finds so many of them living inside Old Delhi, in Shahjahanabad, somebody working as a maid, somebody, destitute. There's one person who is a sweeper in a press, and all of these people are very resigned to their fate. So, and as you said, the book had been translated. It had 13 reprints from 1922. Last year, this book came out, Tears of the Begum, in the 100th year of the publication of the original Urdu. There were 13 reprints of the book till 1942. There were innumerable versions of it in various Indian regional languages, but never in English. Now, one reason for that, I feel, is that the war happened, Second World War, and then immediately after that, 1947, the partition. People in the trauma of the partition forgot the earlier trauma, in which I think the seeds of the partition also lie, that is 1857 and the uprising, and the policies that were adopted after that.
Also, my other question to you was, why did you sort of arrive at doing this translation? I mean, how did you think of doing Begumat ke Aansoo?
When I read about this, I felt that these are stories that need to be told. Because, as I said, we know what happened to Bahadur Shah Zafar. We know, we have this very piteous picture of him being captured, sitting there with his British captors behind him and two of his sons. And, I wanted to bring the stories of the other people, because their sacrifices and the trouble that they went through, their tragedies, we don't know, because like in one case, Mirza Quresh was his son and his wali ahed, or his heir apparent, Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar. Mirza Quresh was captured by Major Hudson from Humayun's tomb, but while Hudson went to round up more of the sons who were later on killed in Delhi, the one kindly man in the British force, an Indian man, he told Mirza Quresh to escape. And Mirza Quresh, not knowing what to do anyway, he escaped. He came to the court of the Raja of Udaipur, the Maharaja of Udaipur, where he was given employment. He was a very skilled sitar player. And so he lived there as a faqir, like a yogi, with all those yogi marks, etc. And that was his disguise. So nobody could find out. And Hudson hunted high and low for Quresh, but he could not find Quresh. Then one day somebody came from Delhi, and this Quresh in his new avatar was playing the sitar. And this man says, you have to be Shahzada Quresh, because nobody else could have played the sitar like this. And you know, like this was happened privately. His identity was protected, because even right till he died, Hudson, and not Hudson but the British, because Hudson died in 58, but the British were hunting for him. So he died without ignominy. And you know, I often feel that when we say where are the, you know, the survivors of, or the descendants of Bahadur Shah Zafar, in cases like this, how do we know where they are? They would not be knowing themselves that they are the descendants.
Also, the other thing about these stories, which are very powerful, as I said, a lot of them are about the women from that time. You know, so sometimes when we look back at histories, some of these narratives sort of don't, you know, they're not documented adequately, let's say. I'm not a historian, but from whatever I've read. But Begumat ke Aansoo is also about a lot of young women, and to have to go through that kind of brutality experience and to live life in that way at the ages of 16, 18, 20, and so on. What would you say in terms of, you know, what was the role that women were playing in the 1815 struggle, and how does this book contribute to an understanding of that?
I think once you read this book, you understand that, you know, like they were just जिसको कहते हैं ना कि महलों से नोच लिया उनको. They were just plucked out of their royal existence and sent out into the world. You have the story of Naz Bano, who dies because, you know, she has no idea of how to keep walking and barefoot and being beaten up, etc., etc. And she dies in the process of the escape. The elder sister Sultan Bano survives, and she tells the tale to Khwaja Hasan Nizami of how the Khwaja Sara, who was supposed to be looking after them and who had been given the custody of these two daughters. Again, they were the daughters of Mirza Quresh. And Mirza Quresh gives the custody of the daughter to the Khwaja Sara. They just loot whatever, you know, the jewelry. These girls were all, would have been wearing a lot of jewelry, so all the jewelry, etc., was looted. These girls were just left out, and then they become, somebody is a cook in someone's house. And, you know, so the kind of, as you said, the brutality that these women suffered, we don't talk about it. We very rarely talk about the fate of the women. You know, as in any war, the women are, you know, I think a casualty, because their bodies become a battlefield. And they were, you know, like in many cases, some of them in the story of Mirza Mughal's daughter, she is, you know, like she is separated from her mother and the child Lala Rook are running away. They are separated. The mother is taken away by one of the people who are looting them. And in many cases, these were the Indians themselves who were looting these royal. And they just take them, one of the villagers takes the mother to his village, and the daughter is taken by another village. They are separated, and then you can just imagine what can happen to these girls.
Also, I feel that when you look at how the communities outside of the royals react to what is going on, in that there seems to be, you know, there is something that you can draw even in today's time in terms of, say, how power plays out, or how people react to powerful people, and, you know, how they see it almost like an opportunity to, you know, to express their anger, or through aggression, through not being supportive, or, you know, so, I mean, how do you see this as a reflection of how, in a situation where the powerful have been sort of, you know, disenfranchised, how real, or how, real of course, but how in the current context, how would you see the significance of these stories?
I think I can explain it. Where there's a story in this of Bahadur Shah Zafar himself, and that gives the story of how he goes to the dargah and he, you know, hands over the relics. And he tells the Sajjada Nashin, he said, we had also taken the crown from somebody else. Now another ruler is going to take the crown away from us. You know, it's the nature of life that the wheel keeps turning. Power never stays with anybody. It's always transient. And these, you know, in the story, these stories, when I was translating, it was very tough because I cried through a lot of the stories. I dreaded, reaching the end. I used to always keep praying, I hope this girl is intact. I hope this girl is, you know, safe. So till I didn't reach the end, I didn't know whether she was safe or not. So they are very stoic in their, you know, acceptance of fate, and very resilient. Like there is one lady who was because her identity is not given, she didn't want to reveal her identity, but from whatever I've read, what I could deduce was that she may have been the wife of Mirza Nil, who was the Shah Alam's son. And that she, you know, like she's given, afterwards, after 1864, many of these survivors are given a small stipend, like 2 rupees a month, 5 rupees a month. And she's given a stipend also, and with that she buys a house, and she puts that house on rent, and then from that rent, she spends half the money on taking another house on rent and being able to eat. Because what can you get for 10 rupees a month or 5 rupees a month, even in 1860? So, you know, when she's telling her story, she, you know, it's very, very piteous. And, you know, like, Khwaja Hasan Nizami keeps describing the dignity of this lady, that though they're living in very straitened circumstances, they're living with a lot of dignity and trying to maintain that dignity even in this kind of circumstances. So, you know, like accepting fate and the transient nature of everything. I translated this while COVID was happening during the pandemic. And I kept thinking, you know, what are we striving for? What are we fighting for? What do we keep trying to achieve? Everything is so, jisko duniya kehte hain na, कि आना जाना है, फानी है दुनिया तो. It's so transient, and yet we are trying to grab onto power, we are trying to grab onto everything, and exploitation, cruelty. There's no, if you understand the meaning of life, then there's no sense in all that. Just be happy and content with what you have.
Since I'm also from Delhi, you know, there were parts of the book which I found so like I could connect with, you know, the places you mention, the communities that you mention. There's reference to Nizamuddin Aulia ka Darbar, and then there are places in what we call Old Delhi now, you know, the names of bazaars. And how much of that Delhi is there now?
दिल्ली तो है, लेकिन वो दिल्ली नहीं है. मतलब वो सड़कें हैं, वो गलियां हैं, लेकिन उनमें रहने वाले लोग नहीं हैं, और वो तहजीब नहीं है.
Why don't you read us an excerpt from whichever one of these stories that were particularly you felt?
I'll just read a short passage from Mirza Mughal's daughter, Lala Rook. As I said, she and her mother, they escaped from the fort. This all happens in 2 days, 18th and 19th of September 1857. By 20th, the British are inside the fort. So they are separated, they are looted, and again, in most cases, these were, as I said, many cases, of course, the British captured them, executed them, but those who managed to escape the British fell foul of the villagers who looted them for their money and the jewelry that they all ran away with. So here is Lala Rook, who talks about how she was separated from her mother, and then she was very young, she was 8 or 9 years old. She's taken home by a ghosi, local ghosi in Gurgaon, who keeps her in, that was one of the soldiers, he keeps her in their house, and they treat her like, one of the helping hands in the house. And so she says, you know, after the family we were living with the wife of the family kept complaining, you keep sitting around the whole day, why don't you do some work? We are not running a free kitchen and you only get food if you work. I asked her, tell me what to do, I will do it. She replied, sweep the house, clean the buffalo dung and make cow dung cakes from it every day. I replied, I don't know how to make cow dung cakes or sweep, I have never done any work. I am the granddaughter of the Emperor of Hindustan. However, fate has brought me to this pass, and I will do whatever you tell me. Show me how to do all this a couple of times so that I may learn. That woman was very kind-hearted, and she taught me how to sweep and make the cow dung cakes, and soon I started doing it. One day I had very high fever and was lying in bed when her husband came and seeing me asleep, kicked me and said, "It is 10 o'clock and you are still sleeping. This is not the Lal Qila, but a Ghosi's house. Get up and do your work." I got up with tears in my eyes and said, "Forgive me, I have erred. I will immediately finish my work." Thus, in my sick state with high fever, I swept the house and made the cow dung cakes. At that time, I was very naive, but now I know about my troubles. My heart gets restless. I keep reflecting on the troubles that we had to go through because of the action of those rebel sepoys. We were residents of the palace whose grandeur and beauty were incomparable. We made poet write wondrous verses in its praise. The walls of the palace had this verse inscribed on it: "Agar firdaus barru'e zami ast, hami asto, hami ast, hami asto, hami ast." If there is a heaven on earth, it is this, it is this, it is this. But destiny has brought us suffering, and now we have to roam like nomads, searching for shelter and make cow dung cakes to survive.
We have
5 minutes?
we have 6 minutes.
One question and then we can do
You know, this thing that even you mentioned, and it's there in the book, and you mention it in the preface itself, even before you start the translations, that there is a sense of resignation in Zafar's sort of, he feels resigned to his fate in some ways. He said, like you mentioned, that we've ruled for so many years, now it's time for someone else to take over the reins of power, right? That's what he sort of, in a sense, he is resigned to this, and then he moves on, in whatever way, that sad way. But so this is the interpretation of one slice of history, which is very, very sad. But in the current context, Rana, there is just so much talk about how history is being interpreted, reinterpreted. So what is your next thing? What are you sort of going to bring to us, which is again going to look at aspects of history which perhaps have not been written about?
No, there is a discipline now called decolonial history. And that's becoming very popular all over the world, where we are now seeing history not through the lens of colonialism or the imperial powers. And I like to think that this book is, like some kind of testimony in that way. And we have to now see history and not in the context of when it happened. We can't judge history from today's lens, because so often we try to see history, like we live in a democratic state, and we expect certain emperors maybe 500-700 years ago to have also behaved like a democratic ruler instead of, a monarch or an absolute monarch. So these are things that we have to now see in context, that what they were doing before we can pass judgment on them. And for that, it's very important I'll come back to a very favorite topic of mine. It's very important to read history written by trained historians or by historians, and not on WhatsApp.
Do you want to tell us a little more about what next? You haven't said it yet. I'm sure everybody's waiting.
And I think, before we end, because just to set the mood, which has become a little sad, I'll ask Vidya ji to sing a song for us, something to relate it to this topic.
This is all my fault. I was telling her something that I have
थोड़ा सा
done.
mood था, क्योंकि रोते हुए नहीं जाना चाहिए यहाँ से.
अच्छा. Actually, मैं इनको एक पुराने folk song का जिक्र कर रही थी कि 1857 के दौरान there were some songs that were documented. I mean, the songs came out later in the linguistic survey, but they were sort of thematically linked to. So there's one really, क्या ही कहें, sweet, powerful, sad, सब कुछ है उसमें. It was titled The Dirge of the Begums. So it seemed really, because she was talking about the book, and तो 2-4 लाइनें उसकी सुनो. This is really your session. I shouldn't be doing this.
I insist.
बुरा मान जाएंगे JLF वाले. अब कैसी करी हो निमक हरामी देसवा बेगाना कर दी हो रे अब कैसी करी हो निमक हरामी देसवा बेगाना कर दी हो रे गलियन गलियन रैयत रोवे हटिया बनिया बाजार रे अब कैसी करी हो छूटी मीना बाजार रे मोती महल की बैठक छूटी अब कैसी करी हो जो मैं ऐसा जानती मिलती जाए लाट से हाँ हाँ करती पैया पड़ती छूटे गाँव देसवारे अब कैसी करी हो निमक हरा We only have 1 minute, so maybe we can take one question. That's about it.
In the passage that you read out loud, I think you mentioned how the women kind of resented the rebels. If they were like, oh, we lost all of this because of the rebels. Was that a common theme, or was it the finger pointing towards the rebels and what they did, or finger pointing towards the British?
This is about the, can you speak up?
Yes, sorry, is this better?
The passage that you read, yeah.
Yeah. So the passage that you read out loud, it kind of mentioned that they resented the rebels, of like finger blaming on the rebels. Was that a common theme throughout the women, or did some of them also kind of blame the British?
No, it wasn't a common theme. It was, as I said, those who escaped the British fell foul of the villagers because these were women who were running away from the fort. They had a lot of jewelry, very rich clothes, and in many cases you see that they're stripped of everything. Like there's one prince who's running with his mother. His mother is stripped of everything, and the prince keeps crying and saying that at least leave me enough for her dignity, but they don't leave. So and in many cases you will see that the British, when they capture, and they immediately execute the men on very flimsy grounds. And without any, there's no legal recourse to these people. They take the witness of, like all these, the thieves and etc. There's one story in this, where, the Mirza Neil story itself, where they are, like the husband and the son are executed by the British immediately, just on the say of a thief.
Thank you. I'm sorry. This thing is beeping at me. You should have taken more questions then.
No, that's
but
okay.
thank you, Rana,
After
for
out.
making history so interesting and making, bringing out some very important aspects of history. For those of you who haven't read it, please pick up a copy of Begumat ke Aansoo immediately. Thank you all.
And I'm always available. You can discuss anything more.